In the last episode, we looked at three different types of research design used by psychologists: observation, correlation, and experiments. Each design is suited to answering a different type of question. But the key take-home message was that if you want to find out what causes what, then you need to conduct an experiment. In this episode, we're going to unpack what it is about an experiment that allows researchers to make stronger claims about cause and effect. Every experiment starts with variables, the things we measure or manipulate. An independent variable is something that we change deliberately. For example, we might manipulate the levels of light in a studying room so that we have a brightly lit studying environment and a dimly lit studying environment. A dependent variable is something that we measure. For example, we might be interested in the test scores of those who studied in the brightly lit environment and those who studied in the dimly lit environment. Identifying your independent and dependent variables is the first step in designing an experiment that will say something meaningful. But you also have to try and take account of other variables that might otherwise quietly interfere with your experiment. These are called confounding variables, which are things that you haven't controlled for that might be unevenly distributed between your groups and therefore affect the outcome of your study. For example, maybe the brightly lit studying environment was also quieter than the dimly lit studying environment, making the confounding variable noise. If we don't account for things like that, then we can't be sure that it was the lighting that was making the difference to the test scores of the students. Confounding variables illustrate why control is so important in experimental design. Control means making sure that the groups you're comparing are similar in ways that are likely to affect what you're measuring, except for the thing that you're intentionally manipulating. To do that, researchers use a few key tools. First, there's random assignment to conditions, which applies when you're comparing different groups of participants. And it means that every participant has an equal chance of ending up in any group. This means that any individual differences in your participants that might affect your dependent variable are just as likely to occur in any of your experimental conditions. So their effects should cancel out rather than become confounding variables. For example, if you were designing an experiment to look at the effectiveness of a new approach to studying, then randomly assigning participants to your experimental groups would reduce the odds of your groups being different with respect to things like student ability levels. Next, we have control groups, which are groups of participants that are not subjected to the manipulation of our independent variable. These give us a baseline to compare against the group that received the experimental manipulation, so we can see if our independent variable really had an effect. For example, if we wanted to design a study that looked at the effect of drinking coffee on alertness, we'd need at least two groups. One group that were given coffee to drink and another group that weren't given coffee to drink. That way we'll be able to see whether measures of alertness were higher for those that were given coffee to drink than those that weren't. But in this example, the presence of such a simple control group wouldn't be enough for us to conclude that any differences in alertness were due to the consumption of coffee. After all, increases in reported alertness from those who've been served a cup of coffee might simply reflect the fact that those participants expected to feel more alert having just drunk a caffeinated drink. This is an example of a placebo effect, and to eliminate it, we'd need a control group in which participants were served decaffeinated coffee, but not told that their beverage didn't contain caffeine. If that group's alertness levels were comparable to the group that was served caffeinated coffee, then we'd know that our results were due to the placebo effect, rather than our experimental manipulation of the consumption of coffee per se. Experimenters also use a process called blinding to reduce the impact of expectations on how participants behave and also how researchers interpret their data. In a single blind experiment, participants don't know which experimental group they've been assigned to. This is to try and avoid something called demand characteristics, where participants actively adjust their behaviour in accordance with what they think is supposed to happen in the experiment. In a double-blind study, the experimenter is also unaware or blind as to what experimental group each participant is in. This helps protect against the experimenter expectancy effect, which is where a researcher inadvertently influences the behaviour of their participants in a way that supports their experimental hypothesis. So we've seen how experimental tools like random assignment and control groups can help us isolate the effect of the thing we're manipulating. But how do these tools help us figure out whether variable X causes variable Y? Well, psychologists rely on three core conditions when deciding whether one thing causes another. And the experimental tools we've just reviewed are what allows us to meet those conditions. First, there has to be a relationship between our independent and dependent variables. This is called covariation. Let's say we conducted an experiment to look at the effect of sleep deprivation on memory performance. In one of our experimental groups, participants were only allowed to sleep for 4 hours. In the other group, participants were allowed to sleep for 8 hours. The following day, both groups were given a memory test. In this instance, our two variables, amount of sleep and memory performance, would need to change together. For example, people who slept more might tend to remember more. If there isn't a relationship between variables, then one obviously doesn't cause the other. Features of a well-designed experiment, such as clearly defined variables and consistent measurement, allow us to detect this kind of a relationship clearly and reliably. Second, cause has to come before effect, not just in time, but in the way that the experiment is structured. In our study, participants slept for varying amounts of time before they took the memory test. Well-designed experiments carefully manipulate timing, for example, deciding when an intervention occurs in order to achieve this condition. Contrast this with a correlational design on the same topic, in which a researcher gathers data on participants' sleeping habits and their memory performance. Although this type of design would allow us to see whether measures of sleep and memory were related, the lack of temporal control would mean that we couldn't make causal inferences about the effect of sleep on memory. Finally, we need to ask, could something else explain our results? This is the principle of the elimination of alternative explanations, and it's where the features of a well-designed experiment really pay dividends. We use control groups to compare outcomes, and we try and keep everything else constant. So in our sleep experiment example, the participants in both groups would sleep in the same environment, and they would both take the memory test at the same time of day. But of course, we can't control everything. That's why we used random assignment of participants to experimental groups, to try and ensure that unpredictable individual differences in things like stress levels are spread out evenly across the groups. If we make good use of key features of an experimental design, then we reduce the odds of something other than sleep being responsible for differences in memory performance. The conditions of covariation, temporal precedence, and the elimination of alternative explanations are the foundation for causal reasoning in psychology. And the key features we've just covered of a well-designed experiment are how we ensure those foundations are in place. So we've performed a carefully designed experiment and the results have gone the way we expected. Can we say that we've proved our hypothesis? Well, not quite. In psychology, we tend to avoid using the word proven, not because we're being evasive, but because psychology deals with probability, not certainty. Even well-designed studies can feature variables that weren't controlled for or measured that can still affect the outcome. That's why psychologists don't treat a single result, even from a very well-run study, as the final word. A finding isn't considered reliably demonstrated till it's been observed in a number of well-designed studies that have all measured and controlled the key variables in a similar way. Replication helps us build a more complete picture of when and how an effect within psychology occurs. That's why psychologists avoid using the word proven. We tend to use terms like supported by evidence, statistically reliable, and replicated across well-designed studies. Experiments might not give us absolute proof, but they allow us to make much stronger and more confident claims about cause and effect. And when researchers replicate experiments, we get to see which effects are robust and reliable and which ones might need some more testing. In the next episode, we'll address how psychologists measure the mind. How do we turn something like happiness or intelligence into a number that we can work with? So if that's something that interests you, hit those like and subscribe buttons, turn on the bell notification icon, and I'll see you in the next episode.